Imagine standing at the edge of a forest in medieval Europe. You know another village exists somewhere beyond the trees, perhaps only 20 kilometers away.
Close enough that today you could drive there in less than half an hour.
Yet for a farmer living in the 13th century, that village might as well have existed in another country.
Or even another world, not because mountains blocked the way, not because an enemy army guarded the road, and not because the distance itself was impossible, but because between those two villages stood one thing: a forest. A forest so vast that it could swallow roads, silence travelers, erase landmarks, and isolate entire communities for generations.
Today, we think of forests as beautiful places to visit, places of recreation rather than survival. We expect hiking trails, park rangers, maps on our phones, and emergency services if we become lost.
In medieval Europe, none of those expectations existed. Stepping beneath the canopy meant leaving behind the certainty of civilization. Every tree reduced visibility, every bend in the road concealed what lay ahead, and every passing hour increased uncertainty. A familiar path could slowly become unfamiliar, even without the traveler realizing exactly when it happened. The forest was not merely part of the landscape. It was one of Europe's greatest natural barriers. For centuries, it quietly reshaped how millions of people understood the world around them and their place within it. Today, we often imagine medieval Europe as a network of castles, villages, and bustling market towns connected by roads. But that image is incomplete. Between those settlements stretched enormous forests that interrupted movement in every direction. Maps make everything appear connected, yet reality was very different from what modern people usually imagine. To understand medieval Europe, we must stop thinking like modern travelers and begin thinking like medieval ones.
Today, distance is measured in kilometers. In the Middle Ages, distance was measured in uncertainty.
A village 15 kilometers away across open farmland might feel surprisingly close and easy to reach. The same distance beneath an ancient forest could become an entire day's journey filled with uncertainty. A traveler never knew exactly what waited beyond the next bend in the road or behind the next line of trees.
A flooded stream, a fallen oak blocking the road, or a section of trail reclaimed by thick vegetation could suddenly appear.
Sometimes the greatest obstacle was simply a confusing intersection, where several woodland paths looked almost exactly alike.
Any one of these obstacles could delay the journey, force a detour, or completely change the traveler's route. Every unexpected obstacle consumed precious daylight, and every delay increased the danger of remaining inside the forest. Slowly, nearby places became psychologically distant, because every successful journey depended on favorable conditions and careful decisions. The forest did not simply increase travel time. It transformed the way people perceived distance itself.
Imagine growing up in a village completely surrounded by forest, hearing about another community hidden somewhere beyond the trees.
A merchant mentioned buying grain there, a priest spoke of its chapel, and distant relatives carried stories that few villagers could ever verify. Entire generations could spend their lives hearing about neighboring settlements without ever seeing them with their own eyes. The forest did not simply separate locations, it separated experience, leaving neighboring communities to grow apart for generations. This isolation transformed communication because every important message depended entirely upon a human being carrying it. Every letter, every royal decree, every warning, and every request for help began with one person walking into the forest alone. If heavy rain turned the roads into mud, the message waited. If a bridge collapsed, the message waited again. Entire communities could remain unaware of important events simply because the landscape delayed the messenger carrying the news. While the messenger struggled through the forest, another village continued its ordinary day, completely unaware that important news was already on its way. The forest controlled not only movement, it controlled knowledge itself. because information traveled only as fast as the safest traveler. A neighboring lord might have died weeks earlier, yet nearby communities could continue their ordinary lives because the news had not arrived. Trade faced exactly the same reality, because medieval commerce moved only as quickly as the landscape allowed. A merchant planned far more than the destination. He first asked whether the road itself could still be trusted. A single stretch of deep mud or one damaged bridge could determine whether valuable goods arrived on time or not at all. This uncertainty encouraged many villages to depend primarily upon themselves, rather than distant markets or unpredictable trade routes. Political power also weakened beneath the canopy, because authority mattered only if it could travel from one place to another. Officials had to inspect distant lands, taxes had to be collected, and every royal order depended upon roads that the forest allowed people to use. Even armies respected the forest, because once soldiers entered the trees, many of their greatest advantages began to disappear. Inside dense woodland, visibility collapsed. Commanders could longer see their entire formation, and orders moved far more slowly. Supply wagons struggled through mud and narrow tracks, and a single fallen tree could halt hundreds of men without a battle ever being fought. That is why a single, reliable road through the wilderness could transform an entire region for generations. Its absence could isolate entire generations, allowing the forest to quietly reclaim the connections people once depended upon. Perhaps the greatest barrier created by the forest was invisible. It existed inside people's minds. Most medieval Europeans traveled very little during their lives, learning about distant places only through the stories of those who returned.
Merchants, pilgrims, priests, soldiers and travelers carried more than goods. They carried the outside world itself.
When forests interrupted those journeys, imagination quietly replaced experience, and the unknown slowly became larger than reality itself. Rumors gradually replaced experience, and nearby communities became increasingly mysterious despite being only a day's walk apart.
Communities only a day's walk apart slowly developed different traditions, different accents, and different identities because regular contact became increasingly rare.
The forest quietly allowed separate identities to grow, not because people wanted to become different, but because they rarely met one another. Looking back today, we often see forests as scenery stories. They determined where people settled, how economies developed, how kingdoms governed, and how quickly ideas could ever spread. The forest did not merely stand between villages. It stood between entire worlds that rarely had the chance to truly know one another. Today we often remember castles, kings, and battles. Yet the forest shaped medieval. It grew quietly, one generation after another, until the forest itself became Europe's greatest natural frontier. The greatest wall dividing the continent was never carved from stone. It rose silently from millions of living trees. It did not appear in a single lifetime. It expanded quietly across centuries, one generation of trees replacing another. Against this immense wilderness, every village, every monastery, and every lonely road became only a small interruption in the forest. The forest was never simply a backdrop to medieval history. It was one of the greatest forces shaping history itself. History often remembers kings, castles, and battles. Yet the forest quietly decided how all of them could exist. The true frontier of medieval Europe was rarely marked by walls or borders. More often, it began where the forest swallowed the road. Every medieval traveler understood one quiet truth. The moment the road entered the forest, the familiar world ended behind them. Within only a few steps, the traveler disappeared from sight, and the forest reclaimed the road as though no one had ever passed. Soon, nothing remained except the road itself, disappearing beneath an endless canopy that had hidden countless travelers before him. The greatest wall dividing medieval Europe was never built from stone. It grew silently, one tree at a time. Long before Europe was divided by kingdoms, it was divided by forests. And perhaps that is the continent's most forgotten history.